Okay, so good evening from Berlin and welcome to our today's online event, Fighting Back Jewish Resistance to the Nazis. And thank you all for joining us today. The Holocaust, as all of you know, was not only an attempt to exterminate physically Jewish women, men, and children in Europe to North Africa. It was also a campaign to destroy Jewish culture, religion, and identity. Between 1941 and 1945, 6 million Jews were systematically murdered by Nazi Germany and its collaborators. Amid this unprecedented genocide, Jewish resistance emerged in many forms. Armed uprisings, sabotage, escape networks, and the preservation of education, culture, and religious life. Spiritual resistance, Amida. These acts of defiance, both large and of course small, challenged the Nazi regime's efforts to dehumanize and erase an entire people. Tomorrow marks the 81st anniversary of the start of the Babi Yar massacre, during which more than 33,000 men, women, and children were murdered within 2 days. It was not a coincidence that the perpetrators chose a Jewish holiday. And it was not a coincidence that all these, or many of the mass executions appeared during Jewish holidays. In the concentration camps, mass selections with the aim of murdering Jews were called selections according to the Goebbels calendar. Today, we turn explicitly to Jewish armed resistance against the German genocide. Just 2 days ago, Aaron Bell passed away at the age of 98, better known under his original name Aaron Bielski. He was a Polish-American Jew and member of the Bielski Partisans, the largest armed resistance Jewish rescue group during World War II. May his memory be a blessing. Today, we will hear about Jews fighting in the Red Army by Kiril, as partisans in Belarus by Daniela, and in Zionist youth movements in Hungary by Barnabas. I would like to welcome our distinguished speakers and wish us all a meaningful event. Now I would like to welcome our today's moderator, Joshua. It's a pleasure to introduce him to you now. Dr. Joshua Krug holds a BA from Yale University and a PhD from New York University. He specializes in researching contemporary Jewish literature, culture, and education. He teaches poetry and Jewish studies to young people and adults, encouraging creativity, critical thinking, and cultural engagement. He has led programs in Berlin, Jerusalem, and the United States. Dr. Krug also worked as a school administrator, arts educator, and scholar. And now, Joshua, the floor is yours.
It's a great honor to be all together this evening, also from Berlin. And I have the privilege of introducing our speakers and moderating. And I think because there's so much to engage tonight, so much important work to do, to learn and to grow, we'll begin with Dr. Kiril Feferman. Dr. Feferman is a specialist in the history of the Holocaust and the Second World War. He teaches in the Department of Jewish History at Ariel University. He is the author of numerous books and articles on the security, propaganda, and economic aspects of the war and the Holocaust, and published in leading academic journals. The floor is yours, Dr. Feferman.
Thank you very much for this nice introduction. Let me start and share my piece. Okay. So I'm talking to you now from Washington, but as it was mentioned, I work and for Ariel University in Israel. I would like to thank the organizers for this opportunity to share my reflections on this topic. the topic was and remains very important. It is about the motivations of Jews to fight against their mortal enemy. And it was numerically a very important phenomenon simply because it was the Soviet Union was a very big country and so many Jews, 500,000, according to 300,000 or 500,000 were fighting in the ranks of the Red Army against Nazi Germany. Now, I gave this topic a somewhat provocative title, the Jews' War, as it is well known. It is how the Nazis referred to this war, because they blamed it on the Jews. They said that the Jews were the sole instigators of this war, and they were solely interested in it. And of course, they were the major beneficiaries of the war. It is difficult for me to understand to what extent they themselves believed in this propaganda, but at least this is how this was presented. Interestingly, and this is one of my conclusions after decades of researching this topic, a significant number of Soviet Jews, presumably mainly those who fought in the ranks of the Red Army against Nazi Germany, thought more or less along the same lines, that it was the Jews' war. And I will try to prove it here. Now, trying to understand the dimension of this phenomenon, how many Jews were there, it was on the eve of the war, their share in the army more or less corresponded to their share in the general population. During the war, after so many Jews would be drafted, we are talking about more or less 500,000 people. Probably a bit less, probably more. The estimates are not accurate until this moment. The Jews were highly integrated in the Red Army. They were the most educated part of among all Soviet ethnicities, and the regime and the Red Army Command highly appreciated the Black Jews, men, technical and officer positions, to the extent that during the war, out of 500,000 Jews serving in the Red Army, more than half had officer ranks. This was an unprecedented development in all the armies that fought against Nazi Germany, presumably until these very days. Of course, it is it testifies to the degree to the degree the Jews were trusted not only as a highly educated group, as professionally suitable to man these positions, but also it mattered a lot in the Soviet Union about their political reliability. So generals, marshals, and later on during the war, admirals, there was a significant number of Jews, and this senses the regime was clearly supportive. This Red Army Command were clearly supportive of the Jews and trusted them. In turn, the Jews on the eve of the war were clearly highly appreciated of the Soviet regime, and the reasons are very simple. This was the regime that, at least this is how it was perceived by the Soviet Jews. It brought about the abolishment of the Pale of Settlement, of many restrictions and discriminated that the Jews had been subjected to during the Tsarist regime. Now, several words should be said about the impact of the Nazi-Soviet Pact, or Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, concluded in August 1939, on the motivation of the Soviet Jews who were already in uniform or who would be drafted later after June 1941. It brought about unease and disorientation in their ranks, because they had been trained for years that Nazi Germany was the sworn enemy of first of the Soviet Union and second of the Jewish people. And suddenly, out of the blue, this country seemed to be friendly or more than neutral towards the Soviet Union. There was a clear rapprochement between the two countries, and all negative references to Nazi Germany, its persecution, for example, of Jews, disappeared from Soviet reports starting from 1939 to 41. In this sense, when the Wehrmacht invades the Soviet Union on the 22nd of June 1941, it brought about a sort of moral relief for many Soviet Jews who served in the army, who were in the army, because for them it it meant a return to normalcy. Once again, the Jews were aligned with their country, bent on destroying the sworn enemy of the Soviet regime, of the world communism, and the Jews themselves. This is a British caricature characteristic of this strange period, at least from the Soviet perspective, Soviet Jewish perspective, between 39 to 41, and the story of a great, I would say, moral disorientation in the ranks of the Soviet Jews. So the war starts with the German invasion starts on the 22nd of June 1941, and the result that a huge number of Jews, like anyone else, were urged to join the army. There was a general mobilization or enlistment. In addition, a significant number of Jews volunteer. Those who were they were exempted from the need to serve on account of their belonging to certain group of population. For example, they were regarded as essential specialists. And still, the Jewish motivation, even at the first period, was very high, presumably higher than among other ethnicities, because of this, what I call the Jewish motivation, or special Jewish motivation. We will return to that topic a bit later. So initially, we should say, like anyone else, there was a huge sense of patriotism. The Soviet citizens were certain that the war would end very quickly, and precisely along the lines they were raised on before the war, that we should not forget that the Soviet regime and the global communism before the war were highly assertive, we can even say expansionist in character. So this is how Soviet people, and Jews were no exception to this rule, were raised before the war. And initially, in the first weeks after the German invasion, these feelings are still manifest in the motivation of those who want to join the army. So here is a quotation from a letter written by one of the Jews living in Kiev on the very day the German army invaded the Soviet Union. And now, when the fascists meaning the Nazis or the Wehrmacht, drew our country, please notice our country, into the war, when the Second Imperialist War, the First World War was referred to in the Soviet parlance as the First Imperialist War, is waged on the territory of our socialist state, alongside our entire Red Army will go in its first ranks. So many letters like this were written in the first days, a bit later in the first weeks of the war. And they're characteristic of this wave of patriotism that swept millions in this country. So this is how the Soviet propaganda urged Soviet people, regardless of their ethnicity, regardless of their age, to fight what they call the patriotic war, the war to defend the patria, the country, their own country. Now, several was we should, we are already 10 minutes probably into the lecture. We finally touch upon Nazi Germany, which was presumably, predictably, a very important actor in this equation, which defines the Jewish motivation. So the Jews who served in the Red Army faced Nazi propaganda. Millions of leaflets were dropped on the frontline positions, and Soviet soldiers and officers were exposed, regardless, of course, of their ethnicities, were exposed to these messages. There was also radio propaganda, and so what did Nazi propaganda say? So it emphasized Jewish cowardice, implying that the Jews would do their best to avoid fighting. To the point, they would be ready to send non-Jews, for example, non-Jewish military personnel to fight for them. And of course, they would do their best not to fight at all, presumably, directing the fighting from the rare areas. Now, a very important thing, the Nazi propaganda emphasized that this military struggle was directed solely against two groups within the Soviet population. The first one was the Bolsheviks, a member of the Bolshevik party, and the second one was the Jews. So all others were not targeted. They could surrender. They could, stop fighting, and the war would be over for them. This so claimed the Nazi propaganda, and these people would be spared. What would happen to Jews and the Bolsheviks? And of course, frequently there was an overlap between the two groups. Was not said implicitly, but it was quite clear from these propaganda messages that Nazi Germany would do its best to settle accounts with these two groups. The goals of this propaganda were quite understandable, I would say, in purely military terms, because they aimed at bringing about disintegration of the Red Army, the surrender of the Soviet military personnel. This is how a typical German leaflet looked like. Here you have a translation at the left part, at the left column, beat the eat Politruk, and so this is what the Soviet soldiers were urged to do. Sometimes it worked to the point exactly that there was a mutiny of the Soviet soldiers when they attacked Jewish commanders and political officers, or even their other Jewish soldiers, and surrendered, precisely as the German propaganda worked. But generally, the impact of such propaganda was not direct, but I would say it was a long-term effect. So as a result, it brought about disorientation in the Soviet military command, and I would say these tactics was relatively efficient in the first part of the war, especially the first year of the war. So the goal was to set Jews apart from the Jews and the members of the party, and all other people were invited to surrender, and they were promised some sort of life. Of course, as we know, the German command did not fulfill this promise, especially in the first part of the war. But Jews were not promised anything, and as a result, they very quickly Jewish military personnel, leaving aside their pre-war feelings, they felt that they simply had no choice, absolutely no choice, and they started fighting. I wouldn't say better, but they felt they could hardly afford surrender in whatever form. Of course, there emerged many situations during the fighting when the soldiers, for example, wounded, or their units were entirely encircled, and they simply were in no position to commit suicide. And so, as we will see, there were a number of thousands of Jews, dozens of thousands, who still fell into German captivity. But generally, the Jews were highly motivated to fight until the very end and to do their best not to fall in the German captivity. And the Soviet government was very cognizant of this fact. It was very appreciative of this fact. And in fact, it very quickly learned it had two groups, precisely these two groups that the German propaganda designated, that were the most loyal in the Red Army, the Bolsheviks and the Jews. And as I said, sometimes there was an overlap between the group. Of note is that the fact that the German propaganda and this fierce fighting, which presumably left no chances to Jews, either of course for full Jews, but also for half Jews, to survive in the German captivity, left an imprint on the behavior and motivation of half Jews, or even this significant number. We can hardly, we're hardly in a position to numerically assess them, those who stop identifying as Jews. They were highly assimilated, for example. And so the German propaganda and the character of the fighting, this uncompromising character of fighting, brought about a significant increase of, I wouldn't call it of the Jewish identity, but the specific Jewish motivation, additional Jewish motivation to fight on at any cost. So gratitude, I have already mentioned it as an important fact, gratitude for what the Soviet regimes did, for what it undid in the pre-war period. An important issue that is frequently mentioned in testimonies that there is a sort of Jews feel more solid. The Jews who in uniform feel more solidarity towards other Jews who served alongside them, because their feeling, I would say, was unjustly so, that all of them, regardless of the extent of their identification with the Jewish people, were targeted or would be targeted by Nazi Germany. And a very significant factor that is, again, difficult to access numerically is anti-Semitism in the Soviet Union, the Red Army. This factor is frequently mentioned, sometimes, but sometimes it omitted. I wouldn't say it was present in every place, but very many Jews, especially those who were not officers, in the officer corps, it was somewhat muted. Testified that the anti-Semitism was rampant. In many cases, this was an encounter between the urban Jews who were somehow protected from this brutal ruler anti-Semitism, and Soviet peasants drafted in the Red Army. So, and this was an important motivating factor. I will touch upon it a bit later. Holocaust, we will talk about it later. So here is the a testimony about the impact of the anti-Semitism on the behavior of Soviet officer, Soviet Jewish officer. As a company commander, I had always been thinking that as a Jew, I have nowhere to retreat. Other officers thought only about how to flee the front. In contrast, I was doomed to death, both by the fascists, namely the Germans, and the Soviet counter-espionage. Here we're talking about this notorious NKVD in the army, because they suspected of cowardice, and everyone suspect of it could be subjected to brutal punishment. And it is implied that anti-Jewish feeling played an important role here. Soviet Jewish POWs, I will, for want of time, I will only mention it very, very briefly. The worst place probably for the Jews, even during this war, I'm talking specifically about this Ostkrieg, and the experience they underwent in the German captivity was terrible, even by the contrast, in comparison to what the Jewish civilians in the occupied Soviet territories experienced, and it was life of, day after day, month after month, if they were privileged, fortunate to live that long. And every day they could be betrayed by anyone. And it was a terrible thing. Some of them managed to survive, but the survival rate was extremely low. Now, the Holocaust. We're talking about the soldiers who, at a certain time of the war, become exposed to the information about first it was an abrupt information, then it was, let's say, more solid, that the Germans mistreat Jews. Mistreat Jews to what extent? Universally, all of Jews, or some of Jews, more than other Soviet people. It's a question. Now, in these territories, many of them would directly encounter the outcome of the Holocaust, as you see here in the picture, when Soviet soldiers engaged in the liberation of the Soviet territories, witnessed these mass graves where Soviet Jewish civilians were killed. According to very many testimonies, it made a significant impact of their behavior. We're talking more about revenge, probably, sometimes on a very personal level, when they went through the localities where their own families had been living before the war, before the German invasion, and now they saw, that no one survived, and they saw this mass graves. It made a significant impact, and in many cases, we're talking about a personal war that these Jews were intent and were eager to wage on the Germans, on the collaborators, and significant factor that reinforced their Soviet Jewish identity. Even though, some of them, it may be claimed, viewed this war as we use the Holocaust as precisely as the Soviet propaganda claimed, as the onslaught on all Soviet people, irrespective of their ethnicity. Volunteers, bottom line, Nazi anti-Semitic propaganda played an essential, probably a crucial role in fomenting those Jewish motivation, special Jewish motivation, which of course was highly appreciated by the Soviet command, and because the soldiers were encouraged to fight their own, personal vendettas in this war. Anti-Semitism paradoxically seems to have been another instrumental factor in urging Jews to fight better, to show and to prove anyone that they were not cowards, and they were like anyone else, and probably better than anyone else. And so all these rumors about Jews evading the war were inaccurate, to put it mildly. So, this was, this was an experience that left its huge impact on not only on the generation that was physically involved in the war, but on the next generations of the Soviet Jews, and presumably even beyond the Soviet borders. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Feferman. So for folks who have come to join us, and also for the panelists as well, we want to keep our questions for after all the panelists share. I now have the privilege of presenting Dr. Daniela Ozacky Stern. She is a scholar of Jewish resistance during the Holocaust and World War II, and a lecturer in the Holocaust Studies Program at Western Galilee College. Ozacky Stern earned a PhD in Jewish history at the University of Haifa, studying the Jewish partisans in Lithuania and Belarus during the Holocaust. She earned a master's degree from the School of History at Tel Aviv University, where her thesis dealt with Nazi propaganda led by Joseph Goebbels. This thesis was published as a book. Ozacky Stern conducted postdoctoral research at Yad Vashem and was a European Holocaust Research Infrastructure Fellow at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. In 2024, she was an archive fellow at the Fortunoff Video Archive for Holocaust Testimonies at Yale University. Her publications deal with Jewish partisans in Eastern Europe, the Vilna Ghetto, and Holocaust documentation. She is the book review editor of the Jewish Culture and History Journal. I present Dr. Ozacky Stern.
Thank you so much, Joshua, for this kind introduction. And I want to thank the organizers, Verena, Yaron, Boaz, and all of you here at the audience. I see many friends, so I'm happy to see you. And let me share my screen now. Wait. Okay. So today I want to take you on a journey into the dense forests of Belarus, where a remarkable transformation occurred. Here, Jewish victims who had endured the dehumanizing conditions of ghettos underwent a profound metamorphosis, emerging as partisan fighters who resisted the Nazis from the shadows of the forest. The story I'm about to tell you challenges our understanding of victimhood during the Holocaust. It reveals how ordinary Jewish men and women, stripped of their dignity, their rights, and often after losing their families, found within themselves the capacity not merely to survive, but to fight back, to become true fighters. Let me begin with a moment that captures this transformation perfectly. Reuven Leonid, who had escaped from the town of Olshani to the nearby forests in April 1942, described the decisive moment when Partisan commander Ivan Ivanovich handed him a rusty gun. Leonid had never held a weapon in his life, yet the commander's instructions were stark. You are not allowed to part from this gun unless you die, and now go and clean it. Leonid later recalled this as the happiest moment I had experienced since escaping my town. Finally, I felt myself as a fighter. This moment, the transition from victim to fighter, represents one of the most psychologically complex transformations of the Holocaust. It was not simply about acquiring a weapon. It was about reclaiming agency, dignity, and hope in the face of systematic extermination. To understand this transformation, we must first grasp the brutal context from which these fighters emerged. The Nazi extermination policy in Belarus unfolded with terrifying efficiency through two primary phases. The initial wave of killings from June to December 1941 was executed primarily by Einsatzgruppe B, the mobile death squad that followed the German army eastward. This was followed by a second, more systematic phase from spring 1942 to late 1943, when most ghettos in western Belarus were liquidated. The methods employed was what is called Holocaust by bullets, mass executions through gunfire. Perpetrators would gather Jews, transport them to nearby forests or fields, and execute them into mass graves. By the end of 1942, only about 30,000 Jews survived out of pre-war population of 375,000 in Belarus. For those trapped in the ghettos, daily existence was characterized by systematic physical and psychological abuse. Ghetto prisoners faced constant mortal threats, not just to themselves, but to their loved ones. The Germans employed particularly insidious tactics, conducting actions that targeted different demographic groups, sometimes children, sometimes the elderly, sometimes women, while sparing others who worked for the German war effort. This selective targeting created a cruel calculus of survival that prevented unified resistance while maintaining false hope among the survivors. It was from this environment of terror and degradation that approximately 25,000 Jews managed to escape to the forests of Western Belarus. These escapees faced a moral dilemma: remain in the ghetto and face almost certain death, or flee into an unknown and hostile wilderness where survival was far from guaranteed. The journey from ghetto to forest was itself a form of resistance. Consider the testimony of Shlomo Kantorovich, who was part of a group of 21 Jews who escaped from the Vilna ghetto to the Naroch forests in Belarus on July 23, 1943. He described the moment of departure. We felt like prisoners who had been set free. In the first grove we came across, we decided to pause, take out and assemble the hidden weapons, remove the yellow patch, the symbol of oppression and humiliation, and be free people again. But this liberation came at an enormous psychological cost. The decision to escape almost invariably meant abandoning family members, elderly parents, siblings, spouses, even children sometimes, to an uncertain but likely horrific fate. The moral weight of this choice haunted survivors for the rest of their lives. Many Jews chose not to flee precisely because they could not bear to leave their loved ones behind, preferring to face death together rather than survival alone. Those who did reach the forests discovered that escape from the ghetto was only the beginning of their challenges. Jewish partisans faced what we might call a triple burden of suspicion and hostility. They were viewed with hatred as Jews, as suspected communists, and as robbers who might steal from local population. Non-Jewish partisan units often received Jewish escapees with skepticism, anti-Semitic remarks, and demanded that they prove themselves in battle. The transformation from victim to fighter was neither automatic nor guaranteed. As one partisan manual noted, a Jew's arrival in the forest did not automatically grant them partisan status. Only when they received a weapon did they undergo a profound change, both physically and mentally. This weapon represented far more than a tool of war. It symbolized agency, self-reliance, and the possibility of striking back at their oppressors. The psychological impact of this transformation cannot be overstated. Yaakov Greenstein, who escaped from the Minsk ghetto to the forests, captured this beautifully in his testimony. When we reached the forest, we were beside ourselves with joy. We didn't feel any fatigue. We gazed in amazement at the forest after not having seen or touched vegetation for 2 years in the ghetto, and we felt free. I never knew the forest could be so beautiful. We sprawled on the ground and rolled in the moss. We felt as if we had been reborn and had arrived in a new world. This rebirth was not merely metaphorical. Jewish partisans had to rapidly acquire military skills they had never needed in their previous lives. They learned to handle weapons, navigate by stars, set explosives, conduct ambushes, and survive in forest conditions through harsh weather, especially winters. They developed new identities, often adopting Russian or Ukrainian names to blend in with Soviet partisan units. The effectiveness of these transformed fighters was amazing. Jewish partisans conducted sabotage operations against German forces. They derailed supply trains, destroyed bridges, crucial for Nazi logistics, mounted ambushes, and executed acts of vengeance against local collaborations. While some Jews had previous military experience from serving in Polish or Lithuanian armies, most had to learn combat skills from scratch, receiving basic training in weapons and explosive use in camouflage dugouts, zimlankas, like you can see right here. By the way, those photos of the forest I took when I was visiting those sites. Despite initial skepticism from commanders, Jewish fighters gradually earned respect through their contributions to various military operations, including derailing trains, destroying bridges and communication lines, conducting sabotage missions, and capturing enemy soldiers and collaborators. The Jewish partisan experience extended beyond direct combat to include crucial support roles that proved essential to partisan survival and effectiveness. Jewish professionals such as doctors, nurses, translators, and skilled craftsmen became highly valued members of partisan units. Jewish partisans demonstrated their military competence, participating in everything from cutting telegraph lines and destroying enemy installations to conducting intelligence operations and fighting against both German forces and collaborators. Jewish women partisans went beyond traditional support roles to actively participate in combat operations, including burning bridges, bombing railroads, and conducting urban sabotage missions. They also served as crucial liaisons who gathered intelligence, smuggled medicine from the city to the forest, established contacts with underground networks, and helped lead Jews out of ghettos to the forests. Indeed, Jewish women in the forests of Belarus were also engaged in partisan fighting and even handled German prisoners of war. Let's watch a short clip from the testimony of Tzila Kasov, who was born in the town of Charkovchizne and managed to escape the ghetto and join the partisans. She tells us in her Fortune of Archive testimony how she fought and how also she was supposed to handle a young German soldier whom the partisans caught. Let's hear her fascinating words.
Were you ever in combat yourself with German troops or Ukrainian troops?
Well, we were because, as I said again, we had many zasadas, ambushes. We lost a lot of people in ambushes, a lot of them. We were ambushed many, many times. It's just by sheer luck I escaped. They ambushed us a lot.
Did you learn how to shoot yourself?
Oh, yeah.
And did you find yourself having to kill people?
Oh, yes, I did kill people. And yet, there was one incident. They caught a young German soldier, and they brought him to me. I was the only Jewish girl in this atriat, in this section. They said, he's all yours. Do with him whatever you want to do. A young kid, maybe 19 years old. I don't know, maybe I'm ashamed to tell this. He had a wounded knee. I could not kill him. I fixed his knee. I bandaged him. I don't know what got into me. I could not hurt him. I fixed up his knee. He was a young fellow with blue eyes, a blonde little thing, dirty, skinny, disheveled. I fixed him up. I said, look, turn him over to the prisoners of war. I'm not going to do anything to him. Me being the only Jewish girl, they say he's all yours. I could not kill him.
You remember what you felt?
I don't know. I don't know what I felt. I killed a lot of people, but I didn't have to look them in the eye. I didn't know whom I killed. This one here was staring me in the eye, a 19-year-old. I could not bring myself to kill him. And then I hated myself for the weakness. I hated myself for not being able to kill him. I couldn't. I bandaged his knee, I gave him some food, and I turned him over to the prisoners of war.
Now, you say you hated yourself. Have there ever been times, looking back, when you've loved yourself for not having done it?
I wouldn't know. Sometimes I think maybe I did the right thing. I mean, not every German was bad. Frankly.
So I would love to hear your thoughts afterwards about this, what I think is a fascinating testimony. The partisan movement also gave rise to unique forms of Jewish resistance. Family camps like those led by the Bielski brothers and Shalom Zorin in the Naliboki forest represented a different model of resistance, one that prioritized rescue alongside revenge. These camps sheltered hundreds and even over thousands of Jews, from children to the elderly, creating functioning communities in the forest that served both as refuge and as basis for resistance operations. Perhaps most significantly to our subject today is that the forest saw the emergence of specifically Jewish fighting units. The Nekama, revenge in Hebrew, battalion established in late 1943 in the Naroch forests in Belarus represented the fulfillment of a particular Jewish vision of resistance. At its peak, the unit numbered about 250 fighters, including a significant number of Jewish women. The very name Nekama, revenge, proclaimed its dual mission, fighting the Germans while specifically avenging Jewish blood. The establishment of Nekama illustrates the complex dynamics within the partisan movement. When partisan commander Fyodor Markov suggested the name Nekama, miest, revenge, during the unit's swearing-in ceremony, Chaim Lazar, whom you can see here, one of the fighters who was also my grandfather, noted a certain resentment. We are a bit resentful that a non-Jew is preaching to us about revenge. This moment captures the tension between the universal anti-fascist struggle and the particular Jewish experience of persecution and resistance. The psychological dimensions of this transformation that we talked about until now extended beyond individual fighters to include collective identity and memory. For many Jewish partisans, fighting represented not just survival, but a reclamation of honor and agency that the Nazis had sought to destroy. The act of resistance and fighting became a way of asserting that Jews would not simply be passive victims, but would actively participate in determining their own fate. Yet we must not romanticize this transformation. The journey from victim to fighter was marked by tremendous loss, guilt, and moral complexity. Many partisans carried lifelong trauma from the choices that they had made and the family members they had left behind. The forest could be as dangerous as the ghettos, with Jewish fighters facing threats not only from German forces, but also from anti-Semitic local populations and sometimes from anti-Semitic allies. The impact of these transformed fighters extended far beyond their immediate military contributions. Their stories became central to post-war Jewish identity and Holocaust memory, particularly in Israel, where they challenged the stereotype of Jews going like sheep to the slaughter. The narrative of Jewish partisans provided a model of resistance and dignity that would influence Jewish self-perception for generations. As we consider these remarkable transformations, we must recognize that they represent more than individual stories of courage. They reveal the complex dynamics of human agency under extreme oppression. The Jewish partisans of Belarus demonstrate that even in the darkest circumstances, people retain the capacity for moral choice, resistance, and transformation, transforming from hunted victims into active agents of resistance and revenge. And to sum up, I just want to say that the story of Jewish partisans in Belarus reminds us that human dignity and agency can persist even under the most extreme conditions. These Jewish partisan fighters did not simply survive the Holocaust, they actively shaped its outcome, proving that even in humanity's darkest hour, the human spirit retained its capacity for resistance. Their legacy endures not only in the historical record, but in the ongoing human struggle for self-respect, justice, and the right to determine one's own fate in the face of oppression. They transformed from victims to fighters, but perhaps more importantly, they transformed our understanding of what is possible when ordinary people refuse to accept extraordinary evil. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ozacky Stern. I now have the privilege to introduce Dr. Barnabas Balint. Dr. Balint is an historian of the Holocaust, specializing in the history of Jewish responses to persecution in Hungary and France. He completed his doctorate in history at Magdalen College, University of Oxford. He has held fellowships at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum's Jack Joseph and Morton Mandel Center for Advanced Holocaust Studies, the University of Southern California, the Institute of Historical Research at the University of London, and at Yad Vashem under the European Holocaust Research Infrastructure Connie Crystal Fellowship. He has published widely on Holocaust history with research articles in Holocaust and Genocide Studies, European Review of History, Jewish Culture and History, and the Journal of Holocaust Research, and is writing a book for Routledge. Barnabas is currently a visiting fellow at the UCL Institute of Advanced Studies, where he is writing about Zionism and resistance in Hungary during the Holocaust. We turn to you, Dr. Balint.
Thank you very much. And thank you to everyone from Western Galilee and beyond for inviting me to speak to you today. It's a real pleasure, and it's always wonderful to be able to support such a keen and worthwhile group of academics. So I shall share my screen. Hopefully you can now all see that. Excellent. So when we think about the Holocaust in Hungary, we rarely think about armed resistance. Instead, what most people think about are people like Raoul Wallenberg or Karl Lutz, these famous international figures who carried out incredible and impressive rescue operations in Hungary in 1944. And the Zionist youth movements in Hungary played an important part in supporting exactly those movements and those rescue efforts that we think about. They did that through helping refugees, providing documents, whether those were real, their own identity papers, or if they were forgeries. They gave those people, they arranged safe houses, they provided food, and they linked up refugees with opportunities to work and to to find and rebuild their lives in Hungary before the German occupation in March 1944. Then following that, they repurpose and they try smuggling people out of Hungary, largely across the border into Romania, in an operation known as the Teal, which is a fantastic and very interesting thing that is worth its own talk. This is what the history of resistance in Hungary looks like, sort of currently, and that's an accurate representation of what happened. But what we see there is that armed resistance is very unusual. And so I was very grateful when Verena asked me to speak about exactly this unusual topic for this panel today, because it afforded me the opportunity to research, consider, and talk about something unusual, and a fairly minor part of the history, which is therefore often overlooked. And so my first thought, actually, when Verena mentioned this panel to me, was one line in a biography that I'd read of a Zionist youth movement member who was part of the resistance. And it was a line from the biography of Yaron or Jakub Markowitz. And it said, carrying a gun, he transferred propaganda materials and weapons. Now, I was very used to reading, this comes from a book that I'll tell you a bit about later, a book all about biography, all completely full of biographies of Hungarian Zionist youth movement resistance members. And it's pages upon pages of biographies about people transferring leaflets, transferring propaganda materials, transferring papers, forgeries, real ones, etc. Very few of it talks about weapons, and also very few of them mention, very few of them mention carrying guns. And so this was something that sort of struck out, and it's exactly what made me excited to do this paper for you today, because it's something new. Now, if we dig a bit into what Yaron Markowitz, who he was a member of Hashomer Hatzair, which is the left-wing Zionist sort of scouting movement. In 1944, he was largely working with the movement to help refugees. He moved to Budapest, the capital of Hungary, as part of the movement. The movement would often do that. It would ask its members to move to different places where they were needed, and Budapest, as the big city, was a big hub for these refugees, and he helps them, exactly providing what I was talking about before in terms of documents, food, and shelter for them. In 1943, he was conscripted into the labor service. This was a specific element of the Holocaust in Hungary, where Jews and other minorities were deemed politically unreliable to join the Hungarian army, to be conscripted to the Hungarian army. And so instead they were forced into what was effectively slave labor, largely in construction, but also sometimes attached to Hungarian army units that were posted to the Russian front. He attempted to escape from the Munkaszolgálat, the labor service. At first he failed, but then in October 1944 he tried again and he was successful. He escaped the labor service and returned to Budapest, where he went to a place known as the Glass House, which was sort of an area that claimed extraterritorial status under international law. There are debates over whether or not that was legally correct, but it was certainly something that was a building that was bought by an international, a foreign embassy, and therefore claims to have extraterritorial status within which Hungarian Jews and refugee Jews could stay and be supposedly untouchable by the authorities who sought to persecute them. After being in the Glass House for a bit, he moved to a suburb outside of Budapest, where he was in contact with the Deményi group of communist resistance. Now, this was a small group of communists who did plan some armed resistance. So he's certainly starting to move in these circles. But he then he didn't stay with them for very long. He joined the Megyeri group instead, which was led by a Hungarian named Jóska Megyer, and he worked in Újpest and Kőbánya, where he carried a gun and transferred propaganda materials and weapons. After the liberation in 1946, he moved to Imedalia as part of the Brika, the post-war version of the Teal, this movement of illegal emigration outside of Hungary into Eretz Israel. And he joined a kibbutz in northern Israel, where he lived for the rest of his life. Now, Markowitz is a good example of the work of the Hungarian Zionist youth movements during the Holocaust. He was involved in everything they did, from helping refugees, connecting different parts of Hungary and Budapest, and supporting migration both within and outside of the country. But what's unusual is that he mentions a gun. And so in this paper, I want to look at the memories of arms and of guns, and the ways that Zionist youth movements remembered and approached the idea of armed resistance, somewhat at the time, but also in their post-war records. Now, the historiography on this, although historiography was sort of dominated by ideas of armed resistance in the very early days, the first few decades of the work, in Hungary, there's very little that has been written about armed resistance in Hungary, largely because very little of it existed. Robert Rosett from Yad Vashem is one of the foremost experts on this topic, and he wrote a few articles, one of which I reference here, and he argued that armed resistance was incredibly minimal in Hungary, especially among Jewish groups. Instead, he shows how it was largely only the political party-led Magyar Front, which in mid to late 1944 attempted to pull together different political factions to create some resistance. But even that they even too were hampered by disagreements, political and otherwise, that stopped them from being particularly effective, especially when it came to armed resistance. Now, when it comes to Jewish armed resistance, Rosett quotes Rafi, that should be Rafi, sorry, not Refi, it's a typo in my slide, quotes Rafi Ben Shalom, one of the leading youth movement members who wrote an excellent biography of his time. He quotes that biography when he talks about an incident in Kőbánya, on the outskirts of Budapest, where a group of them struck fascist posts and sabotaged a train line in Christmas 1944. Now, despite this example, Robert asserts accurately and correctly that the Jewish group leaders focused more on rescue, and that these examples of armed resistance and attempted armed resistance were merely a few isolated incidents. So this paper has a look at some of those examples of isolated incidents, as well as how survivors remembered and talked about them in relation to armed resistance. I'm basing this on two collections of sources. The first is a set of biographies of Zionist youth members written by themselves in the ghetto, which are housed at the Ghetto Fighters House archive. Now, they largely take the form of biographies and curriculum vitae, CVs, that were written in response to a call from the Ghetto Fighters House to Hungarian youth movement members wanting to document their lives. They sent in these biographies and CVs, which may have been used to help create certain other sources. And they often are written in a range of languages, some of them Hungarian, some of them English, some of them Hebrew. And they're all now sort of scattered actually within the Ghetto Fighters House archive in various different folders. But they're a really interesting source, especially for getting to the sort of the own words of the people who've written and recorded their lives. And I've accessed these whilst at the USHMM on my fellowship. last year. The second set of sources is written biographies written by David Gur, one of the other leading youth resistance members in the Zionist movement. And he has written them himself, the biographies, which is the source that I was talking about earlier that led me onto this, this idea. It's a huge book. It's actually available online and as a PDF form, so I'd thoroughly encourage people to look at it. It's a great reference collection and includes photographs of each of the members as well. So I mentioned already one example of Yaron Markowitz, but there's a couple of others that I want to present as well. So one is Present Herman, and this one comes from that David Gur book. Now, he was a member of Dror Habonim, which is another one of these youth movement, Zionist youth movements in Hungary. So it's important to remember that there are different factions at play. They often did work together, particularly towards the end of the war, but there is still an element of competition between them. And the only notes that we have that reference his arms in his biography are those four words: he carried a gun. Now, Herman was from Munkac and moved similarly to Markowitz to Budapest in 1941. He was sent by the underground then to Hust to organize an underground movement there. But then he returned to Budapest in late 1944 to try and convince Jews to escape, particularly from the ghettos. He was again captured and put into the labor service, but then after the war moved to Bucharest and then finally made Ariel in 1947. Another example is Arányi István, again from this David Gur book, also in Dror Habonim, so similar to the one we've just looked at. We have a bit more information here. We see that he was caught again, actually, so he was caught multiple times by the authorities, this time by a Hungarian policeman. And it references that he was caught whilst he was carrying the gun. So this really underlines the extra danger that carrying a gun had if you were caught by the authorities. Arányi had contacts with the Swedish Red Cross, who were very involved in those international rescue efforts that I was talking about before, and he was particularly involved in forging documents. Now, one of the really interesting things about Arányi István is that we have two versions of his biography. We have this one from the David Gur book, but then we also have one that he wrote himself for the Ghetto Fighter's House, which you can see here. And it tells us a little bit more information that was missing from the David Gur book. So it states that in 1943, we started to build an armed resistance. And he actually says that they practiced using pistols in the Buda woods. And this is really interesting because it shows us a little bit more about how armed resistance could develop and the actual sort of training and thought process and discussion and approach that would have been involved. He does say, though, that that preparation was short-lived, that after the German occupation, March 44, they decided that rescue was more important. So it really sort of brings us back to that norm in the Holocaust in Hungary and resistance. But it's a fascinating, nonetheless, a really fascinating insight here. You know, having been to Budapest myself so many times and walked in the Buda Hills, I can imagine exactly those kind of forests that he would have been doing in that in, and it's a really interesting spatial comparison to make here as well. And then the final example that I want to speak about is György Löbel. He was a member of Bnei Akiva, one of the very different Zionist youth movements. And he worked as a liaison between leaders in the glass house that I mentioned earlier and comrades. Note that they said comrades. This is an interesting way of talking, right across Budapest. He was involved in distributing forged documents, food and money, much like many of the other people that we've seen today. And when it comes to armed resistance, it noted that in January 1945, he cooperated with the communist anti-Nazi activists and attacked a German machine gun position. So this is very different actually now. So although he had a similar trajectory in January 45, This is where the siege of Budapest has been going on for a month or so. He actually joins some of the fighting forces. He's wounded in that attack and recovers in a Russian military hospital. And then again, 1945, makes Ariel, becomes a major in the IDF. Now, these examples have been important, I think, to recognize. They are only 4 examples from books and collections of much larger groups. And I think particularly if we compare what I've been talking about to the other 2 presentations, I'm talking about a much smaller sample size here. We don't know how many people. That's been a comment throughout this event, that it's really hard to quantify these numbers. Here, the only quantification I can give you is that from the books and the sources that I've read, I've found 4. There will be others. There are certainly others that were involved in this, but we don't have the records. But these examples do nonetheless support Rob Rosett's assertion that armed resistance was minimal and inconsistent. It's not at all, it doesn't come across at all that these people were carrying weapons because that was a policy of the underground. Quite far from it. It's actually shown that it wasn't. But there are some really important points that I think we need to think about as well. And that's that these examples show that some people did carry guns with them when they were going around doing the work for the Zionist youth resistance of liaison and rescue. Now, obviously, we have the question of, do they need to use the gun for it to be armed resistance? What does armed resistance mean is perhaps an interesting conversation and discussion for us to think about. But here we can only generally, apart from the last example, show the act of carrying it. And then secondly, for those who did carry guns as part of their work, they often refer to them in their testimonies and in their biographies. This suggests that they felt it important to write about and that it was an important part of their memory of resistance. So whilst I cannot tell a great story of armed resistance in Hungary, in fact, quite far from it, I have to tell the opposite. I believe we can show that certain members did turn to carrying guns, and that for those who did, it was a key moment of their memories that they remembered and wanted to share when they were talking about their work after the war. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Balint. I wanted to, now we'll transition. So I already see that there are several comments and questions in the chat, and I would have the speakers just maybe scroll up and see what's there already. And for the rest of you, you're welcome to continue to put questions, comments in the chat. We have a little less than 30 minutes. So looking forward to a productive conversation. And speakers are welcome to jump in if you have a response to what you're already seeing in the chat.
Yeah, I have a response. Yeah. Can I say a couple of words? Yeah.
Yes, please.
Yes, thank you. So this
but
is...
you have to explain to what question you are answering so that we will have it on the record.
Certainly. Yeah. I'm answering your question, Boaz. Yeah, but this was the question. Did the murder of Jewish officers during the interwar purges influence Jewish motivation or choices? Insofar as I can judge, it influenced them as it influenced non-Jewish officers. Namely, they were by far, during the war, they were by far less inclined to take initiative and by far more inclined to carry out orders from above at any cost and irrespective of any consideration. So your second question, as for Jews from the Baltic states, we heard research for some Latvian Jews and motivation to join the Red Army was to escape forced labor. Do we see this in Soviet Jews too? Less, we see it much less. Namely, I would say, I did mention it in my presentation, Of course, Jews from the annexed territories were by far less Soviet. They were less Soviet patriots, and what mattered mostly for them was not the identity of the country they were fighting for, but the identity of the country they were fighting against, namely Nazi Germany, and also escape routes. Escape routes, for example, the enlistment to the Red Army as an escape to the German invasion, or the escape forced labor. So yes, but we see it much less in the so-called in the Jews from the core Soviet territories. Oh, yes, there was also a question from Dr. Sage regarding the motivation of the Jewish political officers and to what extent there were an overlap between the Jews and the institution of political officers. Yes, and so first of all, the official statistics still not available, but as far as we can judge, there were many Jews in this position. It was regarded, I would say, with some degree of justification as a Jewish position, and they were particularly conspicuous in 41 when the political officers had the authority to cancel orders of military commanders. This was by the way, one of the reasons why they were so targeted by the Nazis. In 42, when this authority was taken from them by the Soviets, so in fact the famous Kommissar Befehl was resigned in mid-42, and so was the persecution of the Soviet commissars per se, even though Jews who were captured and who were in this position, of course, were still targeted. That's it.
I will ask about this
Wait,
conversation,
sorry, boss.
I have to add to this because I was teaching this today, the Commissar order, and I was speaking about that for the Germans, the commissars and the Jews are the same people. What you are saying now, just to understand, is that it's true. That generally there is a big representation of Jews in the commissars in the Red Army, at least in the beginning.
I wouldn't say, of course, that there is a total overlap. But yes, it was it was visible, noticeable to everyone involved. Even though, as I say, official statistics are still not available.
And thank you. I think it might be valuable to just get everyone on the same page to kind of just and
Yes, sometimes we have a problem in Berlin, obviously, with the internet. He's in the eastern part. So I think I know it from my home sometimes. He was kicked out.
Verena, if you want, I can answer Boaz's question.
I gave a question to everyone.
He just wanted to read out it, so I can do it until he comes back, maybe. So I think I go a little bit up, and we had this question to Kiril, and I would go further now with the question to Barnabas and no, to Daniela. Some of the photos of armed Jewish female partisans look very much staged. The photo you showed was of a woman, it's a question from Boaz, was of a woman in a nice dress, not uniform, who looks like she doesn't know what to do with a gun.
I know there are other photos, but this photo and it's not only this one, there are others where you see like
Okay.
these are the women who never saw a gun and they give them to us, like they pose in this.
No, so I have to like to stand correct this. Those photos are definitely staged. They were taken like a day or two, I think one day even after the partisans came back from the forest back to the city. This photograph specifically was taken in Vilna. And we saw Zelda Traeger, who was actually one of the bravest partisans in her Otriad, in her battalion. And I have to admit that I never thought about how she is dressed. It's not the only photo that we have, but I want to say that her job was to be a liaison, like a courier, taking out, she went so many times from the city to the forest and all over and bringing medicine and people and she was super brave, one of really the bravest female partisans that I know. She had to look like a nice Polish girl just going and visiting her grandmother or something. So if she will be caught, she will have like an alibi. And of course, maybe this is the reason that she's wearing a dress. Maybe she had a chance to change. I'm really not sure, but she is so brave. She was so brave, like so many other women in the partisans.
But the question is, did she go on? I'm not diminishing her, but I think you can see that there are women partisans dressed like fighting partisans, like Vitka and etc., Ushka, and we have women partisans who are totally brave, but they are not fight. Their bravery is not in combat, but somewhere else, and that because you don't see from the photo that she's. I mean.
Okay, I will have to think about it.
Yeah.
Thank you. Would like to read one question from Professor Cohen to Barnabas, to you, Doctor. How much armed was the Jewish resistance in Hungary? When we teach students, we usually differentiate between Hungary, where resistance was rescue, to Poland, at all where resistance was armed, as Daniela has shown. But you emphasize the armed issue.
Yeah, so that's a really important question because it's such an important distinction between sort of the way that resistance manifested itself across Europe. That in Hungary, yeah, the history of resistance is rescue. It exactly is those rescue efforts, whether that's smuggling people across the borders or hiding them in protected houses, providing false documents. It's not at all an armed struggle as it is in other parts of Europe, particularly Poland. I think more what I was hoping to draw attention to here was though that tiny nuance to that narrative to show that even within a history that's dominated about on rescue, there are still certain elements of where people are thinking about armed resistance, or where they're, or actually potentially even to try and break down this binary that we have between armed and non-armed, to show the better integration between those two types. So the way that there are connections between them. So, for example, a lot of the people that I was speaking about, they are carrying guns. They're not necessarily using them, but they're carrying them when they're doing rescue efforts. So it is a history of rescue rather than of armed resistance, but it's one in which a gun is sometimes there. So giving this paper is not going to dramatically change the history of the Holocaust in Hungary, nor should it, because resistance in Hungary is the history of rescue. But I think it's interesting to sort of uncover some of these small nuances and some of these small examples, and then think about how we can blur the lines between places. Kind of like Daniela was just talking about, that some of the bravest people are the couriers. Equally with a lot of the people that I speak about in my research, they're couriers. They're not armed fighters, and there's absolutely no hierarchy of bravery there at all. Like it's an equally brave act to be a courier, and so I think we can start to think about how these histories are connected.
Thank you. I'll ask a question I put in the chat here, and anyone is welcome to engage with it. How should we think about your research in light of Zionism as a movement, and or versus or in relation to local Jewish self-defense? Because we're talking about contexts that are in Europe or in Russia or the Soviet Union, right? In terms of the actual place. Right, and then as we heard, various folks are speaking about the Zionist movement, framing this or engaging within a Zionist context. And so I was curious if anyone wants to reflect on similarities, differences, historiography in relation to armed resistance and place and ideology.
You want me to weigh in? Yeah.
Please.
Okay. Okay. I didn't grasp it immediately. The Soviet Union had a very, I would say, very special relationship with Zionism throughout its history. The Second World War, there was some improvement in these relations. But if we're talking on a personal level and motivations of Soviet Jews, of course, Zionism was not a factor. It was a non-starter for Soviet Jews, probably with the exception of a tiny minority of those living in the annexed territories. But Jewish nationalism, broadly defined, was a factor. And the war and the Nazi aggression, the Holocaust, considerably contributed to the reemergence of Jewish nationalism in the Soviet territories, which seems to have disappeared thanks to the Soviet policies in the pre-war period. But the conclusion drawn by the overwhelming majority of Soviet Jews from this war with the eye to Jewish nationalism seems to have been that Jewish nationalism alone is not conducive to Jewish survival. It had to be necessarily aligned with a big power, and the big power that may give protection, and without it, Jewish nationalism was extremely weak and doomed to extinction, like if just like any other Jewish political current. This was my, I would say, this is my take on Jewish nationalism / Zionism in my territories.
So if I can say really quickly, it's a very interesting question. Many of the partisans whom I researched, they were Zionists. They were members of Jewish youth movements, like Barnabas actually told us about the Hungarian case. And I think that from the testimonies, I know that they were really proud of like giving orders in Hebrew, talking Hebrew in the forest, singing Hebrew songs, talking about Eretz Israel, wanting to go there. So I think that Zionism was really present, and we should talk more about it actually in the research.
And of course, in my research, Zionism is at the forefront. But there are some ways I think that are a little bit more nuanced that we can dig into. So for the first thing is that what I was talking about and the Zionist youth movements in Hungary at the time of their resistance and rescue are part of an enormous transnational network of people and of movements. So many of the leaders in Hungary in 1944 of the Zionist youth movements are themselves refugees from Slovakia, from Poland, and from other sort of northern lands from Hungary. And they are united by their Zionism that has sort of enabled them to find people in Hungary that they can work with. They find the local chapter of their youth movement that existed where they came from, and it exists in Budapest and Hungary as well. And so in a way, Zionism there acts as a transnational network that binds people together ideologically, even when they didn't know each other before. At the same time, it's deeply necessitated. There's a deep necessity for local networks to ensure the success of these operations. So that's everything from getting often they would steal stamps from the government offices that they would then use to make forgeries. Now, often it's easiest to steal a stamp if you work for the organization. So they would send Hungarian Jews who could pose under false papers, who spoke the language, who were able to get jobs in government offices under false papers, to then steal the documents and the stamps. Now that you can't do that if you are very visibly and obviously not from Hungary. They would also rely on guides to take them across the borders, guides who have to know a lot about the local area, where it's easiest to cross, where you can navigate. And then finally, there's the important and fundamental issue of the language of survival and of hiding. This sort of mirrors, but it is almost sort of the opposite for what Daniela was saying. And it's true in the Hungarian case as well, that a lot of these people, they most of the time they write in Hungarian, but there are the elements of Hebrew do slip into what they write. But at the same time, Hungarian is needed as a language to communicate with local people and then to get across borders. So there's key elements there. And then Zionism more broadly has a big sort of a bigger history to play actually in these networks and in these rescue and resistance efforts, which is that a lot of the groups that we're working with here, they're Zionist youth movements and they're the Zionist community in Hungary that have existed for years before 1944. These are established networks, established structures, and they've often been working on migration aims and trying to get passes and documents and entry visas to what was then the British Mandate. And those become part of the rescue efforts in 1944. If they can prove that they have an entry visa to the British Mandate, they can try and use that as a document that proves that they shouldn't be persecuted or that they shouldn't be deported. And it's very useful to prove to the foreign embassies that they should be granted protection. And so the established structures of the Zionist community in Hungary that are already working to support Ariel and to support that community can be repurposed during a time of crisis for resistance. which is another way that these things are all interlinked.
Thank you. Well, it's been a wonderful evening over here in Berlin. Thank you to our presenters. Thank you to Verena and to everyone for being here. Really productive evening of learning, engagement, of research. So unless someone has a final word, let's call it an evening. Thank you.
I will say the closing words since I was left with this. First of all, thank you, Joshua and Verena and all the speakers. This is indeed the issue of fighting back is actually the subject of my MA thesis about the historiography of resistance in Israel. And it is interesting to see that actually this is not a much researched topic. I mean, it was very political and very emotional in the first decades after the Holocaust, especially in Israel, but also in every country where you had resistance. The issue of resistance was intertwined with the political landscape, and who fought and who died, etc., were major issues. And Israel, although the battles were not in Israel, the issues were the same. We start to see academic research in Israel only in the 70s, late 60s, beginning of the 70s. We see academic research on armed resistance, on resistance general, but armed resistance even. And then in the 80s, the whole thing gets discredited with all the postmodernist and post-Zionist ideas, and to the place where we have some sort of conversation, with a group conversation of fighters saying it's good that Yitzhak Antek Zuckerman, one of the leaders of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, is dead already, because he did not, if he would have been alive now, he would have had to apologize for fighting. Because in the moods of the post-Zionist discussion, this was much discredited. What we see now is a beginning of, I hope, of a new wave of academic research. Daniela is, I think, she's the only Israeli I know who wrote in the last so-and-so years about partisans, an academic paper on partisans. And Barnabas did his academic paper on resistance. So we are starting to see, maybe you are both the leaders of a new wave of writing about Jews fighting back. And with all the wars we are going through, it suddenly became really, really important. So thank you all. Thank you, Joshua, Verena, the organizers, Barnabas, Daniela, Kiril, all our friends who came here to share their knowledge. We will put this on the web and people will be able to see it. So thank you very much from Israel. I mean, this is Western Galilee College, but a project that we heard a lot about Berlin. So thank you also from Israel. And we are really, our next event, by the way, will be more provocative. It will be about 7th October and the Holocaust, somewhere in October, late October. So thank you very much and good night.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Boaz.
Bye-bye.